So, good evening, everyone. I'm Tudor Allen, archivist at Camden Local Studies at Archive Centre. Thank you for joining us for tonight's talk. Well, I'm delighted to introduce as our speaker tonight, Darla Jane Gilroy. After graduating from St. Martin's School of Art, Darla set up her own design label, Darla Jane Gilroy, which had a shop in Kings Road, Chelsea. Her design work helped define the British fashion style of the 80s and 90s, and some of her work from this period has been featured in the Victorian Albert Museum. Through her work, she travelled extensively, manufacturing under license in Hong Kong and living in the Far East for 4 years. Darla has had a long involvement with design education as a visiting lecturer, external examiner, and course advisor, teaching at Ravensbourne, Central St. Martin's College of Art and Design, which is in Camden, of course, the University of Westminster, Southampton University, the University of East London, the Royal College of Art, and most recently, the University of the Arts. In 1995, she became the course leader of the BA Honours in Footwear and Accessories Design and Product Development at Cordwainers College. And in 1999, she became head of department and subject leader in fashion at the Winchester School of Art. She was director of the craft programme of undergraduate and postgraduate courses at London College of Fashion from 2012 to 2021, and she is currently Associate Dean of Knowledge Exchange and Reader in Fashion Enterprise at Central St. Martin's, UAL. She has maintained her professional practice through her design and trends consultancy, The Future Perfect, working to predict cultural trends for clients, including McCann Erickson, Advertising Agency, and Unilever. Well, tonight, Darla is going to tell us the story of her mother, Beryl Gilroy, pioneering teacher, writer, psychotherapist, and Camden's first Black head teacher, drawing on her mother's unique memoir, Black Teacher. Now, before we begin the talk, could I kindly ask you to put yourselves on mute and switch off your cameras for its duration? At the end of the talk, there'll be an opportunity for you to ask Darla questions, or you might wish to type your comment or question in the chat, and we'll try to read it out at the end. Many thanks. Also, please note we are recording tonight's talk, but we won't be recording the question and answer session. So without more ado, I'm delighted to pass you over to Darla Gilroy to begin tonight's talk.
Thank you very much, Tudor. I'm just going to share my screen. Brilliant. And I just want to confirm that you can see my screen.
Yes.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you very much. So first of all, I want to thank Nick Durrant for supporting this session. And I want to thank Tudor for inviting me to speak this evening and to celebrate the life of my mother, Dr. Beryl Gilroy, through her memoir, Black Teacher. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the book and about Beryl's achievements. Black Teacher is the story of Beryl Gilroy's experiences of coming to Britain in 1952 and overcoming the very overt racial discrimination that she encountered as she forged a career in education, first as a classroom teacher, and then rising to become Camden's first Black head teacher in 1969. And yes, I did say 1969, so that's over 50 years ago. She worked and lived in the borough for over 30 years. And a key theme in the book is identity. And it describes her journey to redefine herself as a Black woman in a white space. She studied child development and then psychology at the University of London, married a white English man, raised 2 mixed race children, held posts on the Race Relations Board from 1966 to 1972, which was set up in response to the Race Relations Act. And that was the first legislation around racial equality introduced in Britain in 1965. In 1979, she was a founder member of Camden Black Sisters, a community organisation set up to support Black women in Camden, and noted for supporting community activism, particularly during the 1980s. She gained an MA in education in 1980 before moving from her role as head teacher to the Institute of Education as a consultant and researcher. Beryl obtained a PhD in counselling psychology in 1987, practicing as an ethnocultural psychotherapist until her death in 2001. My screen has frozen. There we go. So Beryl worked for the BBC as a broadcaster, and as well as her memoir, Black Teacher, which was published in 1976, she wrote collections of poetry, essays, fiction, such as her prize-winning Frangipani House, published in 1986, which is to the left of the screen, and Boy Sandwich, published in 1989, and In Praise of Love and Children, which was actually written in 1959 and left unpublished. And I encouraged her to publish that book because when I read it, I see threads of Black Teacher in that story. And it was eventually published in 1996. So in the early 70s, Beryl also wrote books for the Nippers series. And these were the first multicultural reading books for children. Many of the stories were inspired by real life experiences of children in her class from minority ethnic communities, most of whom had recently arrived in Britain. She noticed that many of these children were not engaging with reading because they didn't understand or relate to the standard Eurocentric texts used in schools at the time. And the Nippers series is something that's incredibly close to my heart because I can remember her actually writing many of these books, these stories. And they started really with, she came home one day and she said that a little boy had fallen asleep in her class. And she said to him, "Why are you so tired?" And he said, "Miss, I couldn't sleep at all last night." And she asked him why not. And he said, "Well, we had a visit from home." And he described how his two uncles had come from their home country to visit his parents. And his parents were so happy to see them that they'd had a party. And they kept the two little boys up all night while they were sort of having their party. And he came to school the next day and was so tired he fell asleep, tired but very happy. And she captured his story in the Nippers series. And there's actually a book called A Visit from Home. So through this series, she managed to get children in her class to really engage with reading and to become very engaged learners. After her death in 2001, Beryl Gilroy was described as one of Britain's most significant post-war Caribbean migrants. Her memoir, Black Teacher, brings to life the challenges, I think, of the Windrush generation and the challenges that they faced, and underlines the resilience of that generation and their determination to succeed in an unwelcoming and sometimes hostile environment. The book filters Beryl's achievements through the lens of racial discrimination that was commonplace in post-war Britain. But more than that, the book for me is about my mother's attempt to understand those that sought so desperately to diminish her and to try to imprint her with their narrow view of Englishness in order for her to be tolerated, which many of us will find shocking and unrecognizable in today's multicultural Britain. And of course, her search for her own identity as a Black woman. But why is the book so significant? Well, for me, I think the importance of Black Teacher is that it offers a unique first-hand insight into the experiences of the Windrush generation from a female perspective. and is one of the very few books ever published by a Black woman in 20th century Britain. And I think that's quite it's an astounding fact that so few women, Black writers, have been published. Having said this, Black Teacher is a book that I have a really uneasy relationship with. There's something very disquieting, I think, about reading about events that you witnessed from the perspective of a child, written by someone that you were so inextricably bound to, your own mother. Many of those events have started to slip away from me, and they've become less about my mother's life and more representative of a historical moment in time. The book fills me with hope and despair in equal measures. And I think whilst it reflects a particular moment in the history of migration into Britain, and many of Beryl's experiences are located in post-war, colonial, monocultural landscapes, elements of her story still resonate with us today. Othering, search for identity, and intersectionality, the framework of our understanding of how aspects of a person's social and political identities combine to create different modes of discrimination, are as relevant today as they were then. The book was first published in 1976, 7 years after my mother became Camden's first Black head teacher at Beckford School in West Hampstead, within a year of my father's very sudden death, which left her very exposed and vulnerable personally and professionally, and in a difficult place emotionally, because my father had always been such a support to her in her ambitions and in her life in Britain. And that placed her in the glare of the media as a result of the publication of her memoir, and I think put her in a very kind of uncomfortable position. The book was republished in 1998 when Beryl wrote, "In the tradition of Black women who write to come to terms with their trauma, or alternatively to understand the nature of their elemental oppression, I wrote to redefine myself and put the record straight." To mark the 20th anniversary of her death, Black Teacher was reprinted last year by Faber. And I'm sort of very proud of that achievement, because it was the one thing I wanted to do for her, was bring that book back into print. And the introduction was written by Bernardine Evarista, who describes the book as full of wit, perceptiveness, humor, and compassion. A hugely important memoir about 1950s and 60s Britain from the rare perspective of a Black woman transported to the colonial motherland, leaving behind this brilliant first-person record. I think writing the memoir was undoubtedly a cathartic experience, a way to understand oppression and a way to redefine herself. These are the starting points from which to understand and reflect upon Black Teacher. But it is also necessary to understand who Beryl Gilroy was when she first arrived in Britain, and how she was able to navigate the systemic racism of post-war London. One of my favorite pictures, I have to say, of my mother. So who was she? Well, Beryl Gilroy was born in British Guyana in 1924, the only English-speaking country in South America. British Guyana was still a British colony and didn't gain independence until 1970. So she grew up very much as a child of the empire. She lived in Skeldon-Babette, a small town in eastern coastal Guyana on the estuary of the Corentyne River on the borders with Suriname. Her village was at the end of one of the county roads, which she always described as pretty remote. So she was very definitely a country girl. Her father died when she was a very young child, and she was brought up in a large extended family. Her mother was one of 13, and she grew up under the watchful eyes of her grandparents. As the youngest grandchild, she was perceived to be her grandfather's favourite. So I think she learned really early on how to navigate difficult people and difficult situations within her own family dynamic. These were the skills she brought with her to Britain. She used to say, it's not your parents, but your position in the family that determines your future. And I think there was a lot of truth in that for Beryl. She was encouraged to be independent and free-spirited and brought up to appreciate the natural world. Her grandmother was a herbalist, so she knew a lot about the medicinal properties of plants and herbs. And Beryl absorbed all that information all my life. My mother, I never went to the doctor, I'd just call my mother and she'd tell me what to do. So she had a lot of knowledge about how plants and herbs can affect the human body. Beryl was a voracious reader, and she describes her family as literate and privileged because of the access to books that she grew up with. She was academic, bright, and in 1943, she moved from the capital, Georgetown, to further her education and to obtain her teacher's diploma at the Government Training College. Between 1946 and 1951, she taught at the Urban School in British Guyana and then started working for the UNICEF food programme for the disadvantaged, where she developed a lifelong interest in nutrition and the connection between nutrition and how children are able to learn. And this is actually a picture of her teaching outside at the Urban School in Guyana. She always wanted to escape the gaze of her large extended family, which she found, I think, quite stifling. And like most women of her generation, when she reached her early 20s, her family decided it was time for Beryl to marry. So a suitable match was made and she became engaged to a young man in Guyana. But Beryl, ever determined, wanted to experience life beyond British Guyana. So she asked her grandfather if she could come to England and finish her education by studying child development at the University of London. And she arranged all of this herself. Once her studies were completed, she promised to return to British Guyana and settle down. But by this point, she had already obtained a commitment from UNICEF to employ her on their World Food Programme once she had graduated. So she didn't come to Britain with the intention of staying or answering the call to rebuild the mother country after the war. And I think there's an element of bravery and heroism about a young woman who travelled all the way to England alone, leaving her family behind to seek new opportunities. So here she is when she arrived first in England. So when Beryl first arrived in 1952, Britain had started to see the decline of the empire, but Empire Day was still celebrated by millions to demonstrate pride in being part of the British Empire. And yes, she was a product of the British Empire, but she arrived as a confident, self-assured, skilled young woman that had come from a community of successful and valued Black people. British Guyana was untouched by the war, so Beryl was shocked at how impoverished people were in Britain. She arrived with jeans and silk stockings and makeup and perfume, all sent from her family in America, to find rationing was still in place and large areas of London were still in ruins. The picture on the front cover of Black Teacher, the recently reprinted version, was taken from the picture on the right, which is a picture of Beryl taken in 1954 when she was still a student. And it shows Beryl in her university scarf. And this was something that carried immense status in the 1950s. And as someone from the Commonwealth, it gave her student visitor status. marking her as part of an educational elite. When I was researching this period, I found that in 1950, just 3.4% of the population actually went to university. So her university scarf was a symbol of learning that provided her with some protection from the systemic racism all around her. But that didn't last long. And she writes in her memoir, prejudice was a rare thing amongst students, but directly one joined the ranks of the workaday English, life became a fight for survival and dignity. All went well until it was time to take off my student scarf and try to become a teacher. From then on, all was frustration. And these are some pictures of Beryl Gilroy taken from her student days. This is a picture of her meeting the wife of Lord Mountbatten, Edwina Mountbatten, I think at the Commonwealth Club. And this is a picture of her with her fellow students at a student event. So what happened after Beryl graduated? Well, she joined the ranks of the workaday English, and this is one of my favourite pictures of her. It's a picture of her taken at her first teaching job in the East End of London. And I think although Black Teacher starts in the present, it quickly reverts to the point at which Beryl graduates. Although highly qualified, she was denied teaching positions due to the racial discrimination of the time. She writes in the book about applying for a job in a Catholic school because she was brought up as a Catholic, and the priest puts a fatherly hand on her shoulders and tells her, "You see, it's difficult, my dear. I know you're a good person and a Christian. I'm sure you're a gifted teacher, but let's forget that the children are at an emotional age, and then there's the parents. I'm afraid they just would not accept you." I think it's really hard for us to imagine a world where it's inconceivable that a Black teacher could teach white children, but that was the world that Beryl was inhabiting. As her resources dwindle, Beryl is forced to look for other work. This leads her to a mail order company in the East End where she meets Sue, Maeve, Rose, and Hilda. And she gets a job as a clerk due to her college education, which is acknowledged by her boss that she's a university graduate. She befriends Sue, who is riddled with prejudices and hated everyone that wasn't from her immediate vicinity. Sue's not being rude, only inquisitive attitude emboldened her to ask patronizing and ignorant questions of Beryl and accept her playfully ridiculous answers. Although they worked together for months, when Sue moves away, she asks Beryl not to visit because she did not want her new neighbours to see her with a Black person. This is again one of my favourite pictures of Beryl when she did manage to get her teaching job at a Catholic school. And I just love the way that these kids look so happy to be with their teacher. And I always look at this and think of all the people that said that she would never, ever be able to teach in a classroom full of white children. And I think this picture says it all. And I've always wanted to try and find some of the boys in this picture. So disillusioned by her experiences as a clerk, Beryl found a placement to her university student counsellor described as culturally orientated employment as a lady's maid to the aristocrat Lady Anne. And I still find it absolutely astounding that her university counsellor sent her to be a maid, but that's what happened. Despite the astonishment of her fellow students, Beryl took up the placement with Lady Anne in her Knightsbridge home. Lady Anne's family served the empire for generations, and her mission was to instill Englishness in her chosen children, those who came to work for her. She introduced Beryl to the nuances of class consciousness in the British aristocracy through the you and non-you categorization of language of the working and middle classes, as well as giving her a daily reminder that although Beryl thought of herself as English, she could and would never be accepted. This would ultimately force Beryl to find her own identity. And she writes in Black Teacher, I realized afresh that I belonged to a cultural no man's land. However often I had sung, I vowed to thee, my country, on Empire Day in the pouring rain, I was not English. Brought up as we were under the faraway flutter of the Union Jack, I believed that at that time we West Indians did think of ourselves as English. But Englishness, I now realize, contains elements of history, culture, and perception to which I could lay no claim. But through Lady Anne, Beryl learns one very important lesson, which was that education could and should develop many facets of the mind, and that you can become an educated person without ever going to school. This discovery, I think, reshapes her attitude to learning and teaching and the social and psychological development of the children that she then went on to teach. Eventually, her lucky day arrives, and after 2 hours waiting at divisional office and a series of rejections because of her colour, and I think the book describes how she stands in divisional office and the clerk there keeps ringing school after school after school and saying, you know, just one thing I need to tell you, she's black. And then the school saying, no, we don't want her. But eventually she gets a school that accepts her. And she says, and I quote, Beryl was accepted into a school that becomes the only coloured teacher north of the river. And that's how they described her. She is sent to school, as a supply teacher. And then when she enters the classroom, she finds that the class is so frightened of their new black teacher that they're all hiding under the desk, and she has to coax them out to come and meet her. Life at the school was constantly clouded by an obsessive interest in her physical difference, her skin color, the texture of her hair. And she says of this period, it seems that no one could forget it, and no one really wanted me to forget it. I was becoming heartily sick of it, because every single day she was othered and reminded that she was never going to be accepted. And in the book, she writes an extract about a particular incident. I just want to read that short extract. Beryl has secured a teaching position in a Catholic school, and she goes on a nature walk to the local cemetery with her class and with the head teacher, Sister Consuela, who is then attacked by a wasp. And Beryl says to her, stand still, I said. Try and stand still and it won't sting you. Wasps can kill you, said one of the children cheerfully. Hold still, I said, and I'll get it off with my handkerchief. She looked at me, and now there was real terror in her eyes. Don't touch me, she shouted. Don't ever touch me. Keep your hands off me. Sorry, I muttered. It's your neck and your wasp. She stood there totally ignoring the wasp, still looking absolutely petrified. The tramp we'd passed earlier came up with us, and seemingly with her entire approval, held her still, took off his greasy cap and whacked the wasp away. His hands were much blacker than mine. The message rang out loud and clear. Rather than the tramp and his filth, rather than the wasp, rather even than the sting of the wasp, the slightest touch from me. Beryl has many more experiences like this as she moves from school to school as a supply teacher before marrying and having children and moving out of teaching into family life. I think during these years, she became really quite restless for the classroom. She missed the children. She always loved to be amongst children. She missed the noise of the playground and the hustle and the bustle of school life. Despite her very negative experiences, there was a great sense of fulfillment that she got from teaching children and seeing them succeed, despite them repeating their parents' prejudices and the constant undermining of her authority and her capabilities. In the period away from teaching, she continued to write, and she started a reading group for the local North London parents, and she went on to start a school play group. Eventually, Beryl returned to teaching, taking first of all a part-time role and then a full-time teaching post in a very different and much more ethnically diverse landscape of the 1960s. And this picture shows her as the deputy head at Montham School. As a gifted, experimental and imaginative teacher, Beryl now faced new challenges and had to consider the different cultural experiences and expectations of the children that she was now teaching. Sensitive to the needs of this new audience, her child-centered approach to learning meant she was able to turn even the most reluctant children in her class into engaged and fulfilled learners. And this particular picture on the back of it was written a note. She'd written a handwritten note from Beryl saying that this class, when she came to the school to Montham, they gave her the worst class. And this class was the sort of failing class of children who couldn't read, and, you know, everyone had written off. But she went in and within a few months had completely turned that around. And, you know, she would never accept the fact that a child was going to fail. She just would never, ever accept that. And I think that's a great power and testament to her as a teacher. And she says of this period, the pace, the temperature and the pulse of the classroom had to suit each child. She writes, I turned to art and drama to help them towards an awareness of alternatives and to set new boundaries of their thinking. And she certainly succeeded in that. By 1969, she was appointed Camden's first Black head teacher, a post she held until 1982. She faced curiosity and abuse from parents, semi-segregation from some colleagues, and the constant undermining of her abilities throughout her career. But I think the important thing to remember about this woman is that ultimately she got the appointment that she so richly deserved, becoming a pioneering headmistress through her determination, her bravery, and her humanity. Today, we hear so much about the transformative power of education, but Beryl Gilroy's belief in the power of education resulted in a revolutionary career. She was decades ahead of her time. And for almost 50 years, she made a significant contribution to British education, inspiring generations to resist the limits placed on them by post-war British society and its rigid class structure. So her philosophy was very much, you can be anything you want to be and don't let anybody stand in your way. And she instilled that in the children that she taught. Black teacher is sometimes humorous, sometimes poignant, but always inspiring as a story of her struggle against those who sought to diminish her through the lens of racism and to determine her future for her. She was a woman who dismantled obstacles to ensure the success of her pupils, gain the respect of her peers, and to find her place in history. So this is a picture of Beryl Gilroy. This was taken about 6 months actually before she died, and it's her receiving her honorary fellowship from the Institute of Education in 2000. And I think we have to ask ourselves the question here, so what is her legacy? And I think that Beryl entered Britain at a moment when the stars aligned. Not only did she witness the birth of multicultural Britain, but she was a participant. Through her resilience and she unapologetically puts herself out there as a role model for other women. Her writing is an exceptional document of Black British history from a woman's perspective and has been recognised through her award-winning novels, Frangipani House and Boy Sandwich. In 1995, she received an honorary doctorate from the University of North London. And in 1996, Beryl was honoured by the Association of Caribbean Women's Writers and Scholars. And as I said, in 2000, she was made an honorary fellow of the Institute of Education, but sadly, she passed away about six months after that. In 2020, Beryl Gilroy's literary archive was acquired by the British Library. The archive contains working drafts of fiction and non-fiction, letters from her publishers and literary agents, and a selection of books, including 3 unpublished manuscripts and other material, which will be available for research in the autumn of this year. And through celebrating Beryl Gilroy, an exhibition at the British Library, her work as an educator, writer, and therapist is showcased through objects taken from the archive. And that exhibition is currently on at the moment and will be on until June. Through her pioneering ethno-cultural counselling work, she explored the implications and effects of human diversity, pioneering ethno-cultural factors in assessment and as treatment tools. Her clothes have been exhibited at the Victoria and Albert Museum and are held in their permanent collection, and they were featured in the street style and black street style exhibitions over the last few years. Unlike her male counterparts, Andrew Salkey, E.R. Braithwaite, and Sam Selvon, we should honour her many achievements, remember her, and make sure that she does have a place in history. I just want to finish by reading this quote, which I read from Benjamin Zephaniah. He said about Black Teacher, he said, a must read. In Black Teacher, we see the real life of a real pioneer. Her life makes you laugh and her life makes you cry. Beryl Gilroy's strength, intelligence is inspirational. She paved the way for so many of us to get to know her. And I would echo that sentiment. I think she paved the way for so many of us. I think of my own achievements and the things that I have done in my lifetime, and they are so much driven by this woman and the fact that she was my mother. I was lucky enough to have her as my mother. So I would urge people who don't perhaps know about her to read the book and find out about Beryl Gilroy to ensure that she does have her place in history. And I'm just going to stop sharing my screen. And if there are any questions, I'd be really happy to answer them.
Well, first of all, Darla, I'd just like